Good morning, everyone, and thank you all for joining us for this very special presentation this morning, the last in our series of Spring into 2021, a week-long series of presentations by some of the Calgary's leading providers of information and services to help you live your best lives. It's been a very interesting week. Before we begin, as we gather here today, it's vital we also remember the peoples who've gathered here for millennia. This is the Treaty 7 land of the Indigenous peoples of Southern Alberta, the Blackfoot Nations of 𝗖𝐸𝐵𝐿𝐴, 𝗏𝐿𝐴𝐻𝐿𝐴, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, the Stoney Nakoda Nations of 𝗏𝗏𝗄𝐻𝐾, 𝗏𝗏𝗄𝐿 and 𝗏𝑒sley, and the historic home of the Northwest Métis and Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. It is with the goal of reconciliation that we acknowledge the land on which we gather, and we thank the elders of these nations for their timeless contributions to this land. And as I mentioned up front, we've had a very exciting week this past week as we have presented Spring into 2021. We have had a wide range of topics and interests to help people maintain a healthy life and rewarding lifestyle. And today, we're most pleased to feature brain health in later life and welcome Dr. Brandy Callahan. Dr. Callahan received her PhD in clinical neuropsychology at Université Laval and completed postdoctoral training in Quebec City and Toronto. She is currently an assistant professor of psychology at the University of Calgary and Tier 2 Canada Research Chair in adult clinical neuropsychology. Her research focuses on how psychiatric conditions may impact cognitive health and psychosocial functioning in older adults. We've learned this week so much about how our mind and body health kind of worked together and affect our health. And please, Dr. Callahan, let us know, what is the impact on our cognitive health?
Thank you, Colleen. I'm going to hopefully elucidate some of these questions today. I'm going to share my screen. Share screen.
There we go.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so here we go. I'm going to be talking about brain health in later life. I'm going to be focusing on understanding protective and risk factors. And my goal today is really to address some of the issues that I think sometimes seem a little bit contradictory in the media, and also hopefully shed some light on what I believe are issues that are often left out of the conversation on brain health, but are extremely, extremely important to consider. So as Colleen mentioned, I'm an assistant professor of psychology at the University of Calgary. My main responsibility at the university is research. So I'm primarily a researcher. And what I've prepared today is a research-informed talk. So I'm going to be presenting research evidence. I'm going to be breaking it down as clearly as I can. And I'm going to start by just saying that I don't have, I don't have any conflicts to disclose. I'm going to be talking about some products, but I'm not affiliated with any of those products. So no conflicts there. So first, I just want to start by defining what I mean when I talk about brain health. So brain health is a term that's sometimes used interchangeably or synonymously with cognitive health. And it essentially refers to how well the brain is able to carry out tasks involving planning, remembering things, paying attention, finding words, etc. And brain health or cognitive health can be measured formally by a neurologist or by a neuropsychologist, such as myself. And the way that we do that is we compare a person's ability in these domains, so memory, language, etc., to the abilities of other people of that same age, gender, and educational background. And so what I'm presenting here is I want to just present essentially the number of people here on the y-axis that perform across these different cognitive abilities. And you'll see that most people in the population perform pretty similarly in the average range here. And then you'll have relatively fewer people who are in the low and high average ranges. And then you'll have very few people who are at these sort of extreme ranges of outstanding cognitive performance, who we'd call probably gifted. And then down here are people whose cognitive health or brain health is not optimal. So that's what I mean, is these individuals here at the low tail. Again, this is always relative to people of their same age and educational background. And I just want to emphasize that brain aging, it actually begins quite early in life. So around age 30, our abilities start to naturally and normally cognitive decline. And that cognitive decline is a normal part of being human. So just to illustrate this, what I'm showing you here is cognitive performance on the y-axis here of 3 different tests of memory and 3 different tests of speed. And you'll see that, you know, basically as early as age 30, we start to see a normal decline across these different memory tests and across these different speed tests that basically continues to decline across the lifespan. And so, you know, that's not to say that cognitive change is not frustrating. I absolutely acknowledge, as someone who has already started to cognitively decline, I can appreciate that it's frustrating, but I just want to emphasize that it's normal. And again, when we talk about brain health, we're always taking that normal cognitive change into account. And so that sort of brings me to my next question. Now that we've defined what cognitive health is and established that declines in cognition are normal, what's the flip side of that? What's considered abnormal cognitive change? And so essentially, I've established here that a certain decline in cognitive performance across time is normal. Essentially, we will start talking about pathological aging or abnormal aging when there begins to be a discrepancy, a notable discrepancy in cognitive performance between what is considered this normal age-related change, when that change essentially starts to be markedly different from normal, is when we start to think about, again, abnormal aging. And what that might look like here is essentially someone who throughout their life has always been, you know, sort of in the average ranges relative to other people of their age. And then over time, gradually starts performing in these very low levels, again, relative to people of their age. So this is what we would consider sort of this pathological aging. And in many individuals, there comes a point where this decline in cognition becomes so pronounced that it begins to impact a person's ability to remain functionally independent, meaning they start having difficulty paying their bills, preparing meals, driving, etc. And this is generally the point at which we will say someone has dementia. The period leading up to this dementia diagnosis, where we do see basically declines in cognition that are not normal, but that don't quite meet this definition of dementia, that whole period coming before is often referred to as mild cognitive impairment, or MCI. And MCI is generally thought of as the prodromal, or like stage that leads up to a dementia diagnosis. Now, people often ask me, actually, what's the difference between Alzheimer's disease and dementia? And so I just want to clarify that dementia is, again, this decline in cognition that is so significant that it impacts function. But dementia can actually have many causes. The most common cause is the abnormal accumulation of amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles in the brain, which is known as Alzheimer's disease. However, and this is a picture of what neurofibrillary tangles and plaques look like. And again, when these things accumulate in the brain sufficiently to cause this cognitive decline, this is what we call Alzheimer's disease. However, there are accumulations of other types of proteins in other types of diseases that can also cause dementia. So for instance, Parkinson's disease is characterized by the accumulation of alpha-synuclein proteins in the brain. And the accumulation of those specific proteins, again, that characterize Parkinson's disease, can sometimes be sufficient to cause dementia. Oopsie. Vascular disease, such as a stroke, can cause what is called vascular dementia, and the accumulation of TDP-43 proteins in Pick's disease can cause frontotemporal dementia. So basically, dementia is an umbrella term with many different causes, and the most common cause of this cognitive decline is Alzheimer's disease. And today in my talk, I'm going to be focusing on Alzheimer's disease because it is the most common cause of dementia, and also because it's been the subject of most research, so we know the most about it. So because we unfortunately still don't have a cure for Alzheimer's disease, there's been a lot of interest in understanding how we can prevent it. And I'm sure everyone here has heard that some important ways to stave off Alzheimer's disease and to maintain good brain health is to exercise, eat a healthy diet, consume moderate amounts of red wine. This has been there's been lots of media attention given to these things, and the Alzheimer's Society of Canada has been really good about disseminating this information. What I want to talk about today is specifically what it means to exercise and what does it mean to eat healthy. And I'm going to try and give some details about just how much these behaviors contribute to brain health. And then, like I said at the beginning, in my first slide, I also want to talk about a few other factors to consider that are just as important as these health behaviors, but are often left out of the conversation about brain health. So first of all, I want to talk about how we do research to understand, basically how these guidelines are established. So the first way that research is conducted on these types of questions is to compare people who do or don't engage in a certain behavior. So just go out into the world and look at people who are moderate drinkers and compare them to people who are non-drinkers or heavy drinkers, for instance. We can do this with exercise too, or diet. And these are called observational studies. And these are really helpful because they give a real life snapshot of what brain health looks like in people who have integrated these diet or exercise behaviors into their lifestyle. And so we can basically observe in a real life setting how these behaviors impact brain health. However, of course, the drawback of these studies is that people who've chosen to engage in certain health-related behaviors are probably different in lots of ways from those who don't choose to engage in these behaviors. So for example, think of any friends that you might have who are vegetarian. I would bet that those friends are also more likely to practice yoga or meditation. They're probably also non-smokers than some of your other friends. And so if we were to observe that friend's brain health and find it to be very good, it would be hard to tease apart whether that's because of their vegetarian diet or because they do yoga or because they don't smoke. So those are that's sort of the main shortcoming of observational studies. To mitigate that shortcoming, the second approach to studying these questions is to go out into the world and randomly invite people to be part of an experiment where they're randomly assigned to be part of a test group. And in the test group, they would be given controlled amounts of diet or exercise or whatever over a period of time, and compare them to a control group who is randomly assigned to not to receive the program of interest. And the advantage here is that by randomly assigning people to the test group or to the control group, you can wash out any of the other factors that might be confounding your results. So for example, in a diet study, if you're interested in looking at the effect of diet, you might also end up with people who also do yoga and exercise and don't smoke, but they would be just as likely to end up in the test group and the control group because you've randomly assigned them. And so basically you're preventing these other confounding behaviors from pulling the results in any one direction. So that's really why these studies are so valuable. However, the drawback is that it's not really a real life snapshot, right? You're just getting to study the behavior over 3 months or over 6 months, or some of these studies are actually like over 2 years or 5 years, which is quite impressive. But even 5 years of exercise is not the same as a lifetime of exercise, right? So you're really still only getting a snapshot. So that's how these studies are done. And so now, what does the research actually say about diet, exercise, and alcohol? So starting with alcohol, if we just go straight to the question, does it protect brain health? As I said, there are different ways to study this question. So different studies find different things. But as a general rule, I would say that most studies who have looked at this question say that yes, red wine does seem to protect brain health. However, the amount in which red wine is considered to be protective is very small. So roughly one very small 2 to 4 ounce glass of wine per day, up to twice a week if you're over the age of 60, or slightly more frequently than that is okay if you're younger than age 60. So this is a very small amount of alcohol. And I'll actually add here, well, actually, I'll say that after I say this last part. How protective is it? So again, we've established that one small glass of wine is generally considered protective across most studies. However, you'll note that it's moderately protective. So drinkers who fall within these guidelines of small amounts of wine are between 60 and 90% as likely as non-drinkers to develop dementia. So what does that mean? That means that if 10 non-drinkers were to develop dementia, you would only have between 6 and 9 light drinkers who would also develop dementia, right? So the risk is, slightly to moderately decreased. I will note here that this is small amounts of alcohol versus none. The risk is, so the benefits of alcohol are significantly less than the harms of alcohol abuse. So what I mean by that is it is significantly worse to abuse alcohol than to not use any at all. So in terms of risk and benefits here, the worst thing you can do is to abuse alcohol. Generally, by the way, abusing alcohol is considered to be more than 21 drinks a week. So this can be sort of confusing because I'm sure that you have seen in the media some conflicting reports about, oh, red wine is good one week and then red wine is bad the next week, and coffee is good one week and coffee is bad the next week, and dark chocolate and it's good and it's bad. So so this is an example of this, a headline from a few years ago, reality check, are dark chocolate and red wine not healthy after all? And so I just want to say, like, why I want to address why are these headlines out there? Why is it so confusing to know, are things good or bad? So there's lots of conflicting evidence because it depends on what types of drinkers are being compared in these studies, right? And so if you compare people who never drink versus people who are alcohol abusers, obviously you're going to get very different results than if you compare people who are moderate users versus, not alcohol users. And so depending on which groups you're seeing, you're going to get vastly different results from study to study. Another really interesting thing is that it's been found that some people who are completely abstinent from alcohol are abstinent now because they previously suffered from alcoholism. And so now they're choosing to be abstinent. And so it's not quite fair to include those people in a research study as non-drinkers because they may have had a decades-long history of alcohol abuse that might blur the results of the studies. So that's sort of one reason why there's such conflicting results out there. The second thing is it depends what kind of dementia you're talking about. So as I said earlier, Alzheimer's disease is one type of dementia, but some studies actually look at vascular dementia or all types of dementias combined. And so depending on what your outcome is, you're going to find different results across studies because alcohol seems to have different impacts on different types of brain health or different types of dementia. And then lastly, it depends on who you're looking at, right? So it depends on the participants' characteristics. One example of this is that we now know that many people who are interested in participating in dementia research have a family history of dementia. And they may be recruited through dementia clinics or through dementia support groups. And those people may have many physiological differences compared to people who are just recruited out in the general community. And so again, that's something that might change the results of your study. And of course, it depends on the study differences that I talked about before, whether you're looking at an observational study, just sort of observing people's natural behaviors, versus if you're conducting a controlled experiment where you're randomly assigning people to one group or the other. So it's very, very hard to get a clear picture or a straight answer, because it depends on all of these very crucial factors. So moving on to diet and exercise. I'm going to talk, just in the interest of time, exclusively about the Mediterranean diet, because it's received the most attention in the media and in the research world. And so for those of you who are not familiar with the Mediterranean diet, it is essentially a primarily vegetarian diet comprised mostly of fruits and vegetables, whole grains, bread, bean, pasta, and nuts, with regular servings of seafood and some servings of lean meat, and basically almost no red meat or sweets. And so does the Mediterranean diet protect brain health? Again, these are very complex questions to study, and it sort of depends on all these other things I've been talking about before. But the bulk of the literature suggests that it may have small beneficial effects on cognition. And this is especially true for people who already have normal cognition. So if you're already cognitively healthy, a Mediterranean diet may help you to remain cognitively healthy. And it may decrease risk for dementia if it is strictly followed. It seems to be most beneficial in people who have a history of vascular disease, so heart attack or stroke. And in terms of how beneficial it is specifically, again, there's lots of research studies all finding slightly different results, but again, the bulk of the evidence suggests that those who adhere strictly to the Mediterranean diet may be 80% as likely as low adherers to develop MCI or dementia. So again, what that means is that for 10 people who develop dementia who don't follow the Mediterranean diet, only 8 individuals out of 10 of those who adhere strictly will develop dementia. And moving on to exercise, this is potentially the most complex question because there's so many different variables to consider. There's type of exercise, how often you exercise, how intensely you exercise. But basically, it does seem that despite this complexity, most studies find small beneficial effects, specifically of moderate to vigorous aerobic activity. So what this moderate to vigorous means, basically intense enough for you to break a sweat. And aerobic exercise essentially just means something that'll get your heart rate and breathing up. So brisk walking, or cycling, swimming, etc. Not things like golf or yoga, for instance. Those would not be considered aerobic exercise. Now, how beneficial is this moderate to vigorous aerobic exercise? It seems, again, that the benefits are relatively small. Again, studies show that those who engage in these behaviors may be at 80% as likely to develop dementia as those who engage in no exercise or low intensity. So again, for every 10 people who don't exercise and develop dementia, those who do exercise, only 8 of 10 of them will develop dementia. Now, caring about these things, about diet and exercise, really it's about preserving heart health, right? And the reason heart health is so important for brain health is because your brain lives off oxygen and nutrients that are found in the blood. And so it's so important for the blood and the oxygen to get to the brain. And so you want to prevent a weak heart, you want to prevent clogged arteries, fragile blood vessels. And so what I'm presenting here are results from a very, very important paper published in 2013, emphasizing modifiable risk factors for dementia: education, smoking, blah, blah, blah. And you'll see that most of these are related to heart health: smoking, exercise, hypertension, diabetes, obesity, right? I'll get to depression a little bit later, because that's something that's near and dear to my heart. But you'll see here that by addressing these risk factors, most of which are related to heart health, what this is showing is that the number of Alzheimer's disease cases that can be prevented worldwide by focusing on reducing these factors is enormous, right? And so a good rule of thumb is that a healthy heart is really a healthy brain, right? If you want to know how to protect brain health, you can start by protecting heart health. I want to move on now to some of the lesser known, I think, risk factors for dementia. And one of them is hearing loss. Hearing loss is just as strongly associated with dementia risk as these other health-related factors that we've talked about. It's associated with roughly a twofold increased risk of dementia. And what I'm presenting here is a pooled results, essentially, from many studies on a total of 15,600 participants. And what these pooled studies are showing is that on many measures of cognition, so attention, memory, verbal fluency, global cognition, processing speed, reasoning, visual spatial abilities, on all of these outcomes, you see a significant association between hearing loss and cognitive decline over time. And just to emphasize this, another group of experts recently, just last year, published recommendations about risk factors that can be targeted in midlife and in later life to reduce dementia prevalence. And I'm just going to blow up here these risk factors in midlife. Hearing loss was considered to be the most important risk factor that could contribute to a reduction in dementia prevalence if addressed. The mechanisms linking hearing loss and dementia are complex. If anyone has questions about that during the Q&A period, I can try to talk about that. But really, I just want to emphasize that hearing loss is something that's so important to address, because there's evidence that if you treat it, either with a hearing aid or a cochlear implant or whatever, this association with dementia goes away. So really important to address hearing loss if it's an issue. I want to talk very quickly about brain games, because I get a lot of questions about, should I buy Lumosity? Should I buy a Brain HQ? I've heard that they're good for the brain. So I looked into this in preparation for today's talk. The findings are very mixed. It depends on how cognitively healthy or impaired people were at the beginning of the study. So in other words, are people already showing signs of memory decline before the training? That can have an impact. It's also complicated. These studies are also complicated by the fact that the researchers who study the effectiveness of the programs are sometimes the people who develop the program themselves, and so they're biased to find a positive effect. But in general, I found that the most well-controlled studies that I could find showed that there may be a small benefit on cognition, a benefit that is above and beyond what you might see for crossword puzzles or Sudoku or something like that. And again, the benefits are there, but they're very small. And what I mean by very small is they might move you from average to slightly above average. So we're talking the 50th percentile to the 57th percentile. So not a huge improvement. And again, I can talk more about some of these programs if anyone is interested during the Q&A session. But really just keeping your mind stimulated and engaged, whether it's through brain games or, crossword puzzles, Sudokus, or even, learning a new musical instrument or social dance or something like that. All of these things are quite good for brain health. Okay, now I want to move on to the last part of my talk, which is really something that's near and dear to my heart as a psychologist, and that is mental health. So mental health, I think, is often left out of the discussion on dementia risk and brain health or cognitive health, but it's really, really, really important to consider because individuals who have mental health difficulties are at higher risk for cognitive decline and dementia. So just as an example, many studies have found that individuals who are depressed have a twofold higher risk of dementia than people who have never been depressed. And individuals who are socially isolated have a 1.6 times higher risk of dementia than people who are socially active. And I really appreciate Colleen emphasizing at the beginning of this talk today the importance of connecting either online during the pandemic or hopefully soon in person, because there's, again, very strong evidence that treating these things or addressing these risk factors can really help. So just to emphasize this, I want to move back again to this study that I talked about earlier that outlines recommendations about risk factors that can be targeted to reduce dementia prevalence. And I want to blow up this later life piece here. You can see that after smoking, depression and social isolation are the two strongest contributing factors to basically addressing these risk factors can contribute to the greatest late life percentage reduction in dementia prevalence. So these are really, really important factors to consider. And again, that I just want to emphasize. There's evidence also that anxiety is associated with a 1.5 times higher risk than people of dementia than people who have never had an anxiety disorder. Bipolar disorder is very, very strongly linked to dementia, a threefold risk of dementia in people with bipolar disorder than those without. Schizophrenia as well is associated with significantly higher increased risk of dementia. And something that I'm particularly interested in my research program is ADHD. It's been significantly less studied than all of these other things. There's only a handful of studies that suggest that ADHD might be associated with dementia risk. But again, that link is very unclear and is one of the main core areas of focus of my research program. And I'd say that generally, as Colleen said when she introduced me, sort of the links between mental health and cognitive health are the core focus of my research. And I'm really interested to understand why these conditions are associated with increased risk of dementia, and also how dementia might manifest differently in these conditions compared to how dementia might manifest normally in mentally healthy individuals. So this is the point in the talk where I put in a shameless plug for participating in my research. If you are interested in participating in research at the University of Calgary, you can just Google participate in research at UCalgary and you'll be brought to this site. And there is a search box where you can enter my name, my last name, and then you'll be brought to all of the studies that I'm currently conducting. You'll see that most of them have an emphasis on links between mental health and cognitive health. I'm also very interested in understanding how stressors that are potentially unique to later life, like retirement, for instance, or the death of a spouse, how those things can impact psychosocial health and cognitive health and impact just brain health generally, right? Because we know that stress is associated with brain health as well. And again, if you're interested, my lab website is at the bottom of this page and my email address is here as well. So I think I'm going to stop here. I want to leave plenty of time for questions. And so I will
if you'd like to stop your screen share, then we'll open it up for Q&A. Thank you. That was very, very informative, and it's interesting to learn. And the more of these that we do, it's interesting to learn the whole correlation of what affects our body, our mind, body health. I would invite anyone at this time, if you would like to ask a question, Q&A, or chat. And I'm just going to go in here because Maureen has raised her hand. One of the things before I open up here with Maureen is you're very interesting, your findings on hearing loss. As we learned yesterday, several of our attendees today, I think, attended yesterday as well, the presentation with Dr. Kerby Centre and audiology innovations. And she expounded as well the importance of hearing loss and how it affects may affect dementia. So and we've just had Mental Health Week, the first week of May as well. So those videos are up on our Kerby Centre YouTube channel. So if anybody's interested in further information on it, Maureen, I'm going to open it up here. If you have to let you unmute, if you'd like to ask your question, Dr. Callahan.
Thanks. Wow, that was fantastic, all this information. And I like the level at which you presented it so we could all understand, because sometimes that's a difficulty. You talked about dementia, and at the beginning you said you were going to focus basically on Alzheimer's. So are most of the results that you're showing us based on Alzheimer's? For example, like drinking wine as a specific. Is that just Alzheimer's, or does it also affect other dementias that you listed but didn't elucidate on?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Maureen. That's a good one. So in preparing this talk, what I did is basically, instead of focusing on individual studies, I really tried to include specifically a literature that's often referred to as meta-analyses. And meta-analyses are essentially studies that pool the results across dozens and dozens and dozens of studies to basically say, like, we're basically going to average all of these results, and you know, each individual study has its issues, but what's the bottom line here? And so the results I presented were mostly from meta-analyses that averaged results from lots of studies. And unfortunately, meta-analyses, because they're aggregate presentations of results, the consequence of that is that the nuances between studies are often lost. And so some of the studies in these pooled analyses focus specifically on Alzheimer's, others had sort of all-cause dementia. So basically dementia was the main outcome in most of these studies that I presented.
Thank you, Maureen. But we got lots of questions coming in, both chat and Q&A, so I'm just going to try to capture them all here for you. Barb has said, it seems that the factors that affect dementia each have very little effect unless all are practiced in combination. She says, gosh, that's tough to do.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I appreciate how daunting that can seem. I think, you know, what I would suggest in terms of making this seem less daunting is making sure that any vascular risk factors are under control. That means making sure that, you know, hypertension is under control, hypercholesterolemia, those kinds of things. And I think that keeping track of, you know, how much wine you're drinking, what you're eating, how often you're exercising, I think can seem a little bit more manageable if you just focus on, I need my heart to be healthy, right? And so if hypertension and hypercholesterolemia and diabetes are managed, I think can seem sometimes like a more attainable outcome.
Barb has asked, is there any connection between dementia and anesthetic for surgery?
That's a very good question. And The answer is that there does seem to be a relationship in some individuals between general anesthesia and cognitive decline following anesthesia. I'm not too familiar with that literature. I believe it is mostly for individuals who are sort of who are older. So the older you get, the stronger that link is, I believe. Yeah, basically, again, I'm not too familiar with that literature, but there does seem to be a connection there.
Might be something for her to research a little further. Tom says, you mentioned more than 21 units of alcohol per week are negative. How many ounces per unit?
I think in Canada, 5 ounces is considered a standard drink.
I think I have to rethink that when I have a glass of red wine, that I'm having it for medicinal purposes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so also we have Zoom. I'm going to have you open up your unmute so that you can ask your question.
Dr. Callahan, in my younger days, I remember my grandma being senile. You know, senility to old people, but that word doesn't exist anymore. And is it a form of early dementia, MCI you mentioned? First of all, and secondly, I am confused between Alzheimer and dementia again. Alzheimer is a disease, but dementia is the degeneration of the brain. Is it? Or please elucidate. Thank you.
Yeah, so to answer your first question about senility, that you're right, that's an outdated term. Actually, you may be interested to know that technically dementia is no longer a term. As of 2013, the official accepted terminology for dementia is now major neurocognitive disorder, but most people still call it dementia, but technically it's a terminology that we're trying to move away from. And senility is sort of an outdated term to refer to also cognitive decline that's considered to be abnormal. To answer your second question about dementia, so dementia is really a syndrome that you can see, right? Maybe that will be clear. Dementia is something that outwardly you can see that a person's cognitive abilities have declined to the extent that they cannot care for themselves as efficiently as previously. Now, the disease, whether it's Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease or vascular disease, that is something that you can't see, and it's the pathology in the brain. So you may have heard that you actually can't diagnose Alzheimer's disease until a person has passed away and goes to autopsy. That is still true, right? So you can see on the outside that they've declined cognitively, and you can see that that's dementia. You can only see if it's Alzheimer's disease once they come to autopsy and you see that there's amyloid and tau in the brain. So the disease is what's going on at the cellular level in the brain. And again, Alzheimer's disease is the most common thing going on, and the outward presentation is dementia.
Thank you. Suzanne, excuse me, Suzanne has asked, I imagine that the ACEs adverse childhood experiences must have high negative impacts on cognitions, wrapped up in depression, anxiety, and mood disorders.
Yes, thank you for that question, Suzanne. This ties into the sort of globally how mental health is tied to brain health. And you're absolutely right that individuals who have experienced adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, generally are they're at higher risk for cognitive decline later in life. But again, Adverse early life experiences are a risk factor, but we need to also remember that there are lots of protective factors. So, you know, someone who may have had an ACE or an adverse childhood experience in early life, but who has had, you know, a cognitively stimulating job, good social support in their life now, you know, has a healthy, you know, diet, etc. You know, those current experiences can mitigate these past adverse experiences, but you're right that is a risk factor, particularly as it contributes to, as you said, later life depression and mood disorders.
Kim unfortunately joined a little bit late, so she's not sure if she missed the point, but she said her question is, if both parents have dementia in their late 80s, will that increase the risk of their children?
Yeah, that's a good question. It depends what kind of dementia you have. There are certain types of dementias that are more strongly heritable than others. Obviously, Alzheimer's disease is something that has a heritable genetic component. Typically, early onset Alzheimer's disease, so Alzheimer's disease that appears in a person's 40s or 50s, that's considered early onset. That is considered to have a heavier genetic component than later life Alzheimer's disease. Yes, if there's a family history of Alzheimer's disease specifically, that's something that can be considered a risk factor for the child's later life cognitive health. And so all the more important to practice some of these protective behaviors.
Manfred would like to know what the effects of drugs like marijuana or even stronger drugs are on dementia.
That's a fantastic question, and I don't know that I'm going to have a satisfactory answer to that. For ethical reasons, there are not any well-controlled studies on individuals who consume, for instance, there may be studies on marijuana, I'm not sure, but like stronger drugs, you know, like let's say cocaine, there are no research studies that are ethically able to recruit people and administer cocaine to them, right? So the only way we can study those questions is to observe people who are cocaine users and see how they age. But the problem is cocaine users, unfortunately, probably have lots of other health compromising behaviors that are going to impact their brain health. So it's very difficult to tease apart, again, what is the role of heavy drug use versus other lifestyle factors that these individuals are likely to have. So I'm sorry, I probably don't have a good answer to that question.
Suzanne wants to know if you can advise, what is the omega-3 oil that is best, EPA or DHA?
I will be honest, I don't know the answer to that, Suzanne. If you want to shoot me an email, I can actually see if I can find a good quality study and look that up for you.
Dr. Callahan, while we're doing that, if you wanted to type your email into the chat, then and perhaps just when you're sending it to all panelists and attendees, and then they'll get that, they can jot that down, and anyone that has any further questions, there we go. Thank you. Following can feel free to reach out. Glade has also suggested that how about overuse of over-the-counter meds like cold meds, headache headache tablets?
Yeah, good question. So there is some evidence that very minimal use of I think it's aspirin can actually be protective. Again, on heart, it all comes back to heart health, right? So aspirin, as I'm sure many of you know, can be protective in some individuals for heart health, and so that may have beneficial effects on cognitive health. But actually, overuse of over-the-counter medication can actually contribute to things like delirium and accidental overdoses and things like that. And so that's obviously is detrimental to brain health.
Louise has asked, what disease is it when a person can have a couple of hours where they do not know where they were when they returned to coherence? Hope that is clear. I guess, would that be considered Alzheimer or?
Oh, this is in the Q&A. What disease is it when a person can have a couple of hours where they do not know where they are and then they return to coherence? That sounds like it can be a couple of things. That sounds like it could be like a dissociative episode. But if it's something that you're quite confident is occurring in the context of some sort of dementia, the type of dementia that is most commonly associated with fluctuations in consciousness, where a person can seem very lucid in one moment and then very, very confused in another moment, is Lewy body dementia or Lewy body disease. Lewy body dementia is in the same family as Parkinson's disease, so associated with the same types of protein accumulations in the brain. And the part of the brain in which the proteins are accumulating is a part of the brain that's associated with consciousness and awareness. And so Lewy body disease or Lewy body dementia can often be associated with these sort of fluctuations in cognition. Hope that helps.
And Lou has asked, do meds like 𝗵𝗵𝗶𝗴𝗍 have a useful effect?
I'm sorry, Lou, I'm not sure. I don't have an answer to that. I'm not familiar with that medication.
That might be something, Lou, that you can reach out and
Yes, please
try and
do.
get an answer for you. Anyone else have any questions here? Let's go back to chat. Would you please shed some light on sleep apnea and dementia?
So sleep apnea, I'm so glad that you asked that. I was hesitating, should I put it in the talk? I don't know, I didn't want it to be too long, but sleep apnea definitely has associations with cognition, definitely. Again, it has to do with your brain needing oxygen really to function properly. And sleep apnea is a condition in which basically the body stops breathing for short periods of time in the night. And so the amount of oxygen that is received by the brain is reduced. And actually, when I was working clinically, that was one of the questions that we would systematically ask people is, how do you sleep? Do you have any reason to believe that you may have sleep apnea? Because sleep apnea is considered a very treatable condition where if you treat the sleep apnea, usually cognition should return back to normal. So yes, if you believe that you or your partner has sleep apnea, that's something that you should talk to a healthcare professional about, because treating it could really help your cognition.
And David has asked, are there any natural products beneficial to brain health? Are there natural supplements that we should be taking?
I actually looked into this as I was preparing this lecture. I consulted with the World Health Organization recommendations on diet and exercise, because the World Health Organization, again, they sort of pool many high quality research studies, and they sort of compile the evidence and say, okay, what's the bottom line from all these studies? And the World Health Organization actually does not recommend any sort of nutritional supplements or anything like that. So I guess the short answer to that question is there aren't any natural products right now. If you're talking about health supplement, I mean, technically, fruits and vegetables are natural products, right? And exercise. But if you're talking about like nutritional supplements, there's not any strong evidence to support them.
Something that we've heard various times through some of our other mental health presentations was the use of B vitamins that may be helpful, but it sounds like perhaps
potentially B vitamins. Again, from my memory, maybe I can look into this again, but from my memory, the World Health Organization does not recommend any specific supplement.
And yeah, I guess can't hurt, but maybe it's not as relevant as we might think. So Suzanne, does treating depression, anxiety improve the risk of getting dementia, even though you have the underlying issues? Right.
Yeah, so there is some evidence indeed that treatment of these issues does improve or reduce, I guess, the risk of dementia. Yes, the short answer to that is yes.
And again, thank you all very much. It's been a great week, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon.